Okay, so this tutorial is going to be the beginning of a series for Intro to 3D Graphics class that I'm teaching this semester. In the past, I've done a 3D modeling and a motion class, and for the purposes of our curriculum, I think it works best maybe to combine some of that intro level content and then shift some of the other stuff to some advanced topics later on in the curriculum. The other thing that's happened since the last time, since last semester, is now we're fully at version 26, which has a few interface changes. So I've decided to go ahead and just plow my way through some tutorials for the class with the idea that instead of just using some of the older ones, it's probably helpful to have something that covers the new interface, since I have intro level students trying to figure out where the stuff might be. So I've already done some of that in class, so I'm not going to go too much into that. If you are an R25 user from the past, it does not take that long to get used to the new interface. Okay, with that said, this is just a very basic, and I'm not going to go over everything that I've already done in class, but there were a few things that I wanted to cover. So in the class, the whole idea was to create a still life. This is a still life I had created previously. So students were asked to just use some of the primitive objects and place them in the scene in an interesting and pleasing manner. And then, so what I wanted to cover here is how to create a camera and kind of use that as an approach where we kind of, in a very defined way, set up our camera, like where we're going to render from and where is important, so that we can set the lights dependent on that view. And then we're also going to cover how to maybe set up those lights. So the first thing I want to do is for my scene here is set up the camera. But even before I do that, I want to make sure that I'm using the correct renderer. So as a default, Cinema 4D just use the standard as just the setup. I actually don't really know why they do that. I guess maybe they assume maybe some people don't have Redshift to use for GPU or whatever. And this is a slightly older file. I think I have this set up to use with the physical renderer. So before we get started in anything, because when I create any of the cameras and especially when I create the lights and the materials, I want them as default to be the Redshift ones, not the Cinema 4D renderer ones. Right, so at the very beginning up here at the top, next to the material manager that's over here. In fact, oh, I've got still old materials. I need to get rid of those. But I'm going to click on the render setting button, the button, and for the render, instead of physical, I want this to be a Redshift, right? So we'll just, I don't need to do anything else other than that for now. We haven't really talked about the render settings. I'm just going to leave that beef there. And now when I create, especially the lights, there'll be ones that are set up specifically for Redshift. It'll be a little cleaner. Okay, so but before I create the lights, what I want to do is move around in my camera and get a composition that works for me. And I don't know if you can see, there's a little bit of gray over here on the sides. So this is just showing me where the frame will begin and end. So the top and bottom are already seen, but just based on the size of my windows here on my screen, if I make those bigger or smaller, in fact, I'll make it a little bit bigger like this. So you now see that I have some, it's grayed out a little bit. There's some shading at the top and the bottom. So anything that fits inside of that is the frame of what I'm going to render. So I'm gonna just move around. I don't wanna see the edge of the background. I just wanna see. And so I built a little background object. In class, we were just using planes. I did one so it has a little bit of a bevel, but it's the exact same thing, right? So this looks pretty good to me. I'm moving it around a little bit just to make sure I don't have any visual tangents, right? I don't want an object edge here to match up with the edge of another. That just kind of looks weird, right? I want to know what's in front and what's behind in a very clear way. Okay. So that looks, maybe I should move it down so I get the top of that. That makes better sense to me. Okay, so that looks good. I've tweaked my camera. Now, it's very easy to accidentally move the camera around, right? Or, I want to save this kind of view. So what I'm going to do is just create a camera, and I'm going to lock it down. And I can toggle between a default camera, which I'll consider kind of my working view camera, where I move things around and animate or add materials or light. So that's the work camera. And then I'm going to create kind of my render camera, my final view camera, if you want to think of it that way. All right, so to create a camera, I just need to come down to the tools over here, and or the objects, and I just want to create a camera. So I can just click on it and we'll create a camera, or if I click and hold, you can see there are different types of cameras that I create. Some of these are rigged. We're just not going to talk about those for now. Let's just do camera. And if I want to, I can rename it. I'm going to do main camera. And so this looks good. If I toggle back and forth, if I click at the top here, this is a list of all the cameras that I can look through in this perspective mode here. And I have a default camera, it's the default camera, so it doesn't show up in the object list here. And then I have the main camera, right, the one that I just showed. Now, when I created the main camera, because I was in this active view, it's exactly in the same place, right? You don't see any difference. And that's okay, right? I wanted it to be here. What I want to do is lock down that main camera so it doesn't go anywhere. There are several ways to do this, but the way I always show students, and I do for myself, is if I right-click on the main camera, I've got a list of things that I can, tags that I can add, right? We're going to use a couple of these throughout the semester. So if I go to the rigging tags of all things, it has, and these are like little mini programs, right? This is a little mini program. It's an object tag with a certain set of instructions, and its protection has a little no symbol. So if I click on that, a new icon appears here for my camera, and what it has said is I am going to lock down the position, rotation, and the scale of this object that it's applied to. So now if I go into main camera mode, trust me, I'm clicking and dragging for all I'm worth, and it's not moving anywhere. If I go back to the default camera, you can see there is my camera. Right, there's the camera I created, and it's just going to be there. So once I set up my lights and whatever I'm going to do, I can just go right back to this camera, and I can look in and out of it. You can also, in Cinema 4D, click on this little framing icon on the camera, and it does this cool swoopy thing, right? So I can toggle between this camera and whatever the last camera was that I was using. So here's the default, right? So I can zoom in and out. Whoa, right? So this is where I'm going to work as I'm setting up the lights. And then when I want to check and see what the lights look like from the camera's point of view from my final render, I can do it from here, right? Okay, so that's part number one. The next thing is I want to create some lights, and I'm just going to create an area light. This is not meant to get too crazy down into what lights do. But the first part of the assignment we did in class was just moving these primitives around, how to use rotate and translate and that to position them within the four views. So in this case, what I want to do is show a different way of positioning a light. So I'm going to what I'm going to do is create a light with a target. So the light looks at a location. And there's several ways to do this. I'm just going to do it a straightforward way. So I'm going to create this null object, and I would call this target 1. And then I'm going to create a light. Now, remember, you want to make sure that you're in Redshift as your renderer, right? Because there's lights that Cinema 4D uses for its render, and Redshift has its stuff. Anyways, so I'm going to create an area light, and there's several lights that I can choose within this little menu. If I just click on the icon, the default one is going to create an area light, right? So an area light is like a panel of light, right? And I'm just moving it like I would an object, right now. So you can see I'm moving it out, and if I wanted to, I could rotate it around and position it this way. But what I want to do is use a different method for positioning that. And by doing that, I'm going to use a target. So if I click on the area light and I right click under the list of tags again, we have an animation tag, and there's one called target, right? So right click, animation tag, target. And the target is put on here. Again, it's a little mini set of instructions for this one object, and it wants to know what to look at. So I can drag the icon down here and say, hey, you know what, look at this thing. And just because of where they're lined up, it doesn't seem that that's moved that much. But if I select the target and position that somewhere, and if I select the light, I'm just going to move the light out here. The light is, and it's kind of hard to see. In fact, let me do this so you can see it as it's happening. I'm going to turn down the brightness for the light itself. It's a little bit better. There we go. Right, so here is that light, and as I move it, you can see it's rotating so that it's pointing wherever this target is. Right, so I want the target to be this sphere. Now, I could just say, hey, point at the sphere. I always do it with a separate object. So if I'm like, you know, I do want it to look at the sphere, but just a little bit higher or lower or over here, I always think it's good to have a separate control, right? So I can set up that light. So the area light is like a panel, and you can see that it points in the Z direction is where the light is going. You can see these little lines that come off the corner. Right? And this is like a whole light source. It's a whole, it's like a softbox, right, in a lighting studio. So I've positioned that. I kind of jumped the gun just so it would be easier to see, but underneath the object properties for this, I can adjust the intensity of the light. I can adjust the color, the size of it, and the spread. I'm not going to go too far into this, but the best way to do this is at this point just to turn on the IPR. And I'm going to give it a second to kick in. So you can see that this is lighting the scene, and I can move around. But what's more important, in fact, I'm going to go from here into my main camera. So this is the view, right? This is going to be my final fancy view. And at this point, I can tweak whatever that light is going to be. Maybe I show this in class. Instead of using color, I like to use temperature. So a little bit lower ends up being, I think, so this is the temperature of light. So it was like a campfire, a tungsten light, the moonlight, right? So maybe I'll do something kind of blue. I like that. I can also change the size of the area light. So the smaller this gets, let's make this 25 by 25. It won't have as much light intensity. Let's make this 500 just so you can see, right? So the size also relates to how bright it is, right? If I have a tiny little light as opposed to a giant, light source, it puts more or less light out. Also, the smaller it gets, the sharper the shadows get. So maybe let's find a middle. I'm going to do 50. So that's pretty good. So it's a little sharper than what I had before with the giant light. The other thing with the intensity is you could, I'm just going to leave it at 100, and you can change the exposure. I'll talk about that later in the semester. These two kind of work in tandem with each other, but the exposure, you can use a smaller number adjustment to increase the intensity. So that works pretty good for me. The last thing is the spread. Right? So I can change this so that I get more of a spotlight. And of course, as it gets down here as a spotlight, it's focusing all that intensity so it gets a little brighter, right? But the whole point here, and this is just one light, right, that I've set up, and I would want to set up multiple lights for the scene. But the nice thing here is I can toggle back to my default view, and I go to my light, and I'm moving it around like where that light is going to shine, so I can kind of see it from here. But I also want to double check and see like what happens with this shadow in the background here, right? As I move that light source. Right, so wherever that is, and there's several ways. I would maybe set up multiple camera views so I could see them right next to each other. but I'm not going to get to that point with you all right now. So let's just tweak a little bit more. I'm going to go with that. Right? So I like that I can see the shadow side and the light here and the shadow, the way it's framing this kind of corner. I like how the shadow is falling across here. So these are all important things, right? They're all adding to the composition of what's going on. All right, so that's 15 minutes. I'm going to leave it at that. This is, again, just an intro based on our still life assignment that shows how to set up the lights using a target, how to create a new camera and lock it down, and also the reminder that we want to use Redshift as your render, and that's the first thing you want to start with. All right, see you in the next tutorial.